ever went out into any kind of foresty area as a kid looking for amphibians or reptiles, because this is where I lived. The closest I ever got to nature when I was a kid was going to a fish farm with my dad and my brothers to go fishing once a summer. So I'm sort of a late bloomer in herpetology. So I came to frogs and ecology in college, actually. So when I was in an undergrad, I worked with the TA for my ecology class on a project that she had in the forest preserves around Chicago. So these are blue-spotted salamanders. The thing that they're in is called a minnow trap. And we would go out into these ponds, set these minnow traps, and go back the next day and see what was in them. And I remember this was very transformative for me because I was in these waders and I was thigh deep in pond water, and I remember thinking to myself, I can't believe I'm getting paid to play with animals. And that was it for me. So I really loved that experience, and that same graduate student then hired me to work with her for her PhD research in Borneo. So I really had always kind of had this fascination with the tropical rainforest, and so when she presented me with this chance, I jumped at it. I got to live and work in the jungles of Borneo for 6 months. And when I was a kid, I loved nature shows. And I remember hearing as a kid that in these tropical rainforests that were so far away from where I was growing up, that there were millions of species. And I thought, that's not possible. Because I looked out my window and I saw a handful of trees, and I probably could have identified like 2 different birds, and maybe there was a few insects, but there was just no way my little Midwestern brain growing up in Detroit could have fathomed that there were literally millions of species in these areas that were so diverse. And as soon as I got to that rainforest, I thought, I get it now. You see these amazing shapes and sizes and colors of every kind of organism. And instead of thinking, oh yeah, these scientists are like splitting hairs, there's not millions of species, it's just a little bit different, you really can understand what that means to have that kind of diversity. So for me, working in Borneo for 6 months and studying frogs with this grad student was really transformative because it really hooked me in to studying frogs for the rest of my life. And there's a couple of reasons why I continue to love frogs so much, and I'm going to talk about those. So the first thing is that they don't bite. So look at this friendly little guy. So this might sound trivial, but it's very important because for my master's degree, I actually studied birds. So this isn't me, but this is the species that I studied. This is the green-rumped parrotlet. It lives in Venezuela. And when you catch these things, so we had to set up these mist nets every day, and then we would catch these and we had to put rings on them. And when you have them in your hand, they will bite the shit out of you. And it doesn't sound cool at parties if you're complaining about getting bit by birds. You don't sound like a cool, tough guy. You sound kind of like a wimp. And these birds will bite you and they'll get that little piece of skin between your fingers. And as they bite you, they will scream, which is really discombobulating. And they scream louder and louder as they bite you harder and harder. So it just didn't seem cool to be like, yeah, I got bit by a bird. Like if you say like, oh, I got bit by a tiger, like that's cool. Bit by a shark, awesome. But you can't complain about getting bit by birds and keep your like cool factor at parties. So frogs, even though some frogs have fangs, they do not bite. And so I really like it that they don't bite, and I can do my job without getting bitten and without losing cool points. The other thing that I love about frogs is that they're incredibly diverse. So these are all frogs from Borneo. Borneo has several hundred frog species. These are only a few examples, and most of these examples are actually tree frogs because tree frogs tend to be very photogenic. They also are very docile. So a lot of photos that I have are of tree frogs. But frogs have a wonderful array of sort of forms and colors and shapes and sizes. And frogs live on every continent except for Antarctica. And they have an incredible array of adaptations. So for example, this frog on the left is the wood frog. This is a species that occurs here in Pennsylvania. And they have this amazing adaptation to be able to survive freezing. So they occur from Alabama all the way north of the Arctic Circle. And in most of their range, they will at some point experience freezing temperatures. So it looks from the outside that they are frozen solid, but they have something in their blood akin to an antifreeze, and that keeps the blood moving to their vital organs. So they're actually able to survive these periods of freezing. So we don't tend to think of how awesome that is, but these frogs can survive north of the Arctic Circle. This is a frog that occurs, the other one here is a frog that lives in deserts. These frogs are able to burrow down into the sand. They secrete sort of a cocoon around themselves to keep their moisture in their bodies, and they're able to survive long periods without rain. So we know that amphibians have very moist skin. We know that in general they need water to survive. These guys have adapted very well to living in very dry desert areas, and once those rains come and reach the place where they're burrowing, they pop out of that cocoon, they go up to the surface, and they go about their business. So even though individually, amphibians are very sensitive to changes in their environment, if you look across the whole array of frogs that exist, then you see that they really have adapted well to living in many, many different environments that we don't automatically think of. The other thing, kind of echoing some things that Chase has said, is that frogs have incredible variety in their ecology. So this is an example where we see that frogs are actually exhibiting parental care. And again, kind of echoing something Chase said, is that often when we see frogs exhibiting parental care, it's the males that are demonstrating that parental care. And this is not uncommon in the frog world. They also have really crazy variety in their reproductive systems. So most frogs obviously have external reproduction, meaning the females will lay eggs, the males will fertilize those eggs, both parents kind of take off, and then those little tadpoles hatch out of those eggs and grow into adult frogs. But there are lots of species that have different systems. This one is called the gastric brooding frog. And what happens is the female will lay her eggs, the male fertilizes those eggs, and then the female eats those eggs. So she has a special gastric brooding pouch. So those little tadpoles develop in that gastric brooding pouch and eventually pop out of her mouth as little froglets. Cool and disgusting. The only sad thing of this story is that this species is now extinct. So I know, it's sad. But there's also other species where females actually call to the males. So often we know that males call to attract the females. The females have the eggs, and so the males are often in frogs, again, trying to attract those females. But in some cases, and this is a frog from Southeast Asia with male parental care, the female actually calls to attract the males. So you see some of what we think of as sex role reversal in some of these frogs. The other thing that's really cool about frogs is that they have huge biomass. So what that means is that if you added up all the weight of all the individual frogs in a given system, the amount of biomass of amphibians often outweighs the biomass of mammals and birds and reptiles. So in many systems, they are actually the most biomass of all the vertebrates that exist in a given system. And some preliminary estimates indicate that there can be anywhere between 2,900 and almost 12,000 kilograms of frogs per square kilometer. And that is more than elephant biomass in the rainforests of Borneo per square kilometer. So they're massive when you add them all together, which means that they are both, they're very important to the ecosystem, And additionally, it makes for really good study systems for nerds like me. So anytime you kind of are trying to look at ecology or evolution, you want to have good sample sizes. So I knew some people in grad school who studied dolphins, and a friend of mine had a sample size of 1. And that was a little bit sad. If you are studying frogs, you're going to get many, many individuals, and you'll be able to answer really interesting ecological and evolutionary questions. Additionally, amphibia and frogs especially are extremely diverse. So not a lot of people know this, but there are 3 kinds of amphibians. There's Sicilians, which are not Italians. They're limbless amphibians. There are about 200 species of Sicilians out there. We also have salamanders, which are 4-limbed amphibians with tails. There are about 700 species of those. And frogs. Does anyone want to take a guess as to how many species of frogs there are? Ooh, I love it. I heard 3,000, I heard over 9,000. The answer is approximately 7,000. So an order of magnitude greater than the salamanders. So frogs are the most diverse amphibians out there. So this provides, again, a nice kind of group to answer these evolutionary questions when we're looking at what it is, how these different kinds of ecologies and adaptations have evolved. The other thing that I personally love is that frogs are accessible. So I worked for 4 years at a small liberal arts college in Singapore called Yale NUS, and I was able to take my students out into the rainforest and have them hold these frogs. So the student on the left, he's looking at a little frog on this stem. I don't know if you can see it, but his final project for the conservation class that I was teaching was to look at the impacts of traffic noise on this species. The student on the right, this is the first time she ever held a frog. For many students, this is the first time they're ever going to be touching a wild animal, right? We don't often get to hold mammals in our hands that are wild. If you do mist netting, you can maybe catch birds, but most people aren't going to be mist netting. With frogs, I can take students out and they can handle a wild animal in a way that is safe and accessible. So I always like to say that frogs are kind of the gateway drug to nature. So this allows students to have a direct connection with wildlife and with nature. And it's a nice way to hook them in. When you touch something, you have a connection to it that cannot be had in any other way. I know that Matt would love to touch a living dinosaur. Okay, well, I would, but anyways, so I really love it that I can use these frogs to hook students in and to get them excited about nature, and hopefully to get them, no matter what their future career path is, to care about nature and to care about wildlife. So again, I want to keep this short, and so I'm just going to very, very briefly touch on my personal research. So these are all the reasons that I love frogs, why I study them. This is the kind of environment where I work. So I work mostly in Malaysian Borneo. This is a picture of one of my field sites. It's called Danam Valley. It's in the northern state of Borneo called Sabah. It's one of the states of Malaysia. And it's one of the largest lowland rainforest areas left in Borneo. And Borneo has the oldest rainforest in the world, and it has the tallest, this particular site has the tallest rainforest trees in the world at over 90 meters. And I study the frogs in sites like this and other areas in Borneo. And some of the things that I do there, and with the species that I collect there, are what we call species delimitation. So this is describing new species. So in Southeast Asia, there's on average about 3 to 5 new species of amphibians described each year. There's huge diversity and a lot of what we call cryptic diversity, so lots of species that are currently lumped under one name that are actually multiple species. I also look at impacts of climate change. To do this, I utilize museum specimens. I look at how species change over time with respect to climate. So I utilize the collections at the Carnegie Museum, a lot of collections from other museums around the world to look at how mostly morphology and size have been changing with respect to climate. And the main project that I work on is impacts of habitat fragmentation. So the main driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia is plantations of oil palm. So how many people here have ever heard of oil palm or palm oil? Okay, so when I used to give this talk like 5 years ago, almost nobody in America had heard of palm oil. And now it's becoming much more commonly known. In Europe, it's very commonly used. In Southeast Asia, almost every single cleaning product, beauty product, food product has palm oil in it. Here, excuse me. Here in America, we have a lot of subsidies for corn, so we have a lot of corn oil in things and not as much palm oil, but if you look at ingredients lists, you'll often see palm oil. So the main driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia is plantations of oil palm. So I look at how that fragmentation is impacting those communities and looking at whether there are ways we can kind of integrate forest fragments within these agricultural landscapes to maximize biodiversity preservation. Okay, so our take-home messages. We know that amphibians are everywhere except for Antarctica. We know that frogs are the most diverse amphibian. And we know that frogs have incredible mating systems, behaviors, and adaptations. These are two poison dart frogs wrestling. And of course, we know that of all the Muppets, the coolest was the frog. Either you're welcome or I'm sorry that was so short. And I would love to take questions.
5 minutes for questions. Come up and down.
Hi. So I feel like there are a lot of urban legends, rumors, whatever, about safety of handling amphibians and animals in general, right? Both for the humans and the animals. So for those of us who are like in the woods, see something, would be interested in handling it but not trying to cause harm, what are some guidelines?
So the question was, there's a lot of kind of like urban legends or myths about like safety or lack of safety of handling wild animals, and what would be some guidelines for people who are out in the forest. So one, I would just ask that you respect the animals. So even with my students, we're not kind of catching every sort of individual that we see. And anytime I have students handling amphibians, I make sure that the time that they're handling that frog is as minimal as possible because I don't want to stress the animal out. So I would say that common sense in terms of not stressing the animal out. For me personally, there's a lot of herpetologists who like to kind of catch every snake that they see. I tend not to take